Every old empire of which we have record declined. And what always happens when empires begin to decline? Every old empire of which we have record declined. Every old empire of which we have record declined. And that's really what we're talking about, the decline of what became the American empire.
I can't handle this anymore. He's stuck on a rut. First, a little disclaimer here. I am not disputing that the morbidly rich are bleeding us dry. Only Wolff's explanation as to why this is the case.
When that decline happens, a scramble begins in most empires. Those at the top, the rich, do not want to lose all of the wealth, all of the privileges that went with being the upper class of the global empire. And because they are the upper class, they have the wealth and they have the political power to shift the burden of adjusting to no longer being the empire you once were, push that off onto other people. Hold on to your wealth by really sticking it to the mass of other people.
It's just simply ridiculous to assert that the motivation for the wealthiest people in the U.S. is hegemonic decline of the US imperial system. His reasoning is not consistent internally. It's not consistent with history. It makes assumptions that a multipolar world is necessarily a zero-sum game, which is a pretty big assumption. And one of the other things I really can't get behind is an assertion that borders on manifest destiny for China becoming the next capitalist imperial hegemon. I just don't find that an acceptable idea, especially with so many wild cards in play, like the climate, like demographic challenges that all major economies are actually facing, and property market issues that both the U.S. and China face. They are financially ruinous, and it's not clear that China is going to deal with their situation any better than the U.S. is going to.
It doesn't want to face the fact that in the decline of other empires, wars were like punctuation points along the road of decline because you kept saying it was external.
Up first, the internal inconsistency of his own arguments. Wars punctuate rise as well as fall. I mean, look no further than the American Revolution or the U.S. wars against the First Nations as it pursued its sense of manifest destiny on its path to domination of the North American continent. What are we to make of the U.S. Civil War? Was that a decline of empire or something else?
When that decline happens, a scramble begins in most empires. Those at the top, the rich, do not want to lose all of the wealth, all of the privileges that went with being the upper class of the global empire.
Now I'm going to turn to the wealthy. I don't know if Wolff has been paying attention, but since 1970, their wealth has exploded exponentially. And only that, their wealth has become global. And they have no loyalties to nation or state at all, or much less empire. Many of them, in fact, are anarcho-capitalists. They want to get rid of the concept of a modern state, and many of them want to get rid of the dollar or all national currencies to be replaced with crypto that they control.
The anarcho-capitalist views of that contingent were essential in the founding of PayPal, he explained at Libertopia 2010.
The initial founding vision was that we were going to use technology to change the whole world and basically overturn the monetary system of the world. We could never win an election on getting certain things because we were in such a small minority. But maybe you could actually unilaterally change the world without having to constantly convince people and beg people and plead with people who are never going to agree with you through a technological means. And this is where I think technology is this incredible alternative to politics.
Things have never been better for them. So the argument that they're doing this out of desperation in the face of decline is not an argument that holds any water whatsoever. Something else is motivating them. The motivation is not a mystery. It's well documented. Thom Hartmann covers this topic periodically, and I am going to take a brief citation from his recent refresher on this.
There's actually a fascinating backstory here. It goes back to 1951. In 1951, Russell Kirk, who was a kind of a well-known conservative gadfly thinker, published a book called The Conservative Mind. It's still in print. In fact, it went through 3 or 4 different editions before Kirk finally died, and updates over time. And in that book, and probably more importantly and more explicitly in many of the writings about and around that book, particularly by people like William F. Buckley, who argued in print in National Review that whites should continue to control the United States because blacks are inferior. It literally said that. But around that book and that time in the early 50s was this theory among Republicans, among conservatives, that the growing middle class at that point in time was a danger to American democracy. The American middle class in 1951 was growing faster than any middle class had ever grown in the history of the world. By that point, in 1951, about half of us were in the middle class. That had never happened before in any country. And Kirk and others around him, particularly Buckley, predicted that if the middle class continued to grow, we would hit a point where the average working person would have enough wealth that they would have the leisure time to engage in politics, which had traditionally been the sport of the rich. And that once the average American started getting politically active, it would produce chaos. There would be riots in the streets, the country would be on fire, the proletariat would rise up and demand that the rich be taxed to death and all that money be redistributed, and that would be the end of society, the end of democracy, the end of America. Now, when Kirk published that in 1951, there was only a small number of conservatives who took him seriously. They thought he was a crackpot. I mean, Barry Goldwater loved it, William F. Buckley loved it, but Dwight Eisenhower in 1954 said of Kirk, not specifically, but of the billionaires who were funding him, actually, the Hunt brothers, he said, or supporting him, he said, their numbers are small and they are stupid. That was in 54. But then came the 1960s. And so by the end of the 60s, in addition to those things, there were a number of high-profile police killings of unarmed black people that then provoked riots, and so you had cities on fire. So you had women burning their bras, or at least that was the media narrative. You had black people burning cities. You had the war in Vietnam by 1967. You had students burning draft cards. I mean, this was at that point, the conservatives. And the labor movement was in full swing. 1970 was the peak. 5,716 strikes in that one year. Over 3 million workers walked out in 1970. And as that happened, these 4 things happened, these 4 movements, all happened in the 60s. Conservatives looked back at what Russell Kirk had written and said, my God, this guy was a prophet. The country is in flames. The young people are rebelling. The women and minorities no longer know their place, for God's sake. We've got to do something.
When the wealthy became convinced that Russell Kirk and Buckley were onto something, they sprung into action. In short order, Lewis Powell Jr., then a corporate lawyer, wrote his now infamous memo. In it, he recapitulates the assertions made by Kirk and Buckley as fact. He then proposes that business interests and the wealthy collaborate to seize the means of governance. Yeah, I'm putting it in those terms because that's what it is. And boy, did they jump into it. The Koch family is the best known leader and organizer of the entire process. All told, they managed to round up a few hundred fellow like-minded billionaires and companies to spawn an entire industry of think tanks, foundations, nonprofits, and societies to pull American politics and society into a direction they wanted to go in. We've all heard names involved in this industry: the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Federalist Society, ALEC, Americans for Prosperity, the Bradley Foundation, on and on and on. There are literally hundreds of these little organizations that billionaires can fund and wash money through. They use it to buy the GOP. They use it to select conservative judges. They use it to write laws that get rubber stamped by many state legislatures, especially the ones in Republican-run states. And they fund media empires to spread their own ideas, as well as promoting them within colleges and universities. And the motivation for this is the ideological assertion that we are the source of destruction of society and they are order and stability in society itself. And that the only way to preserve democracy and society in their minds is to strip us of all our rights, all of our prosperity, and all of our agency. You have to hand it to him. It does sound like pre-19th century Europe with all the wonders that brought. And that's not the end of it. Like any religious faction, there are extremists within it. Peter Thiel fits this bill. He rejects democracy, and interestingly, he actually rejects capitalism. He wants to run the economy as a monopoly, and he wants to use technology to replace politics.
Stanford is also where Thiel was introduced to philosopher and professor René Girard, who influenced Thiel's worldview. Girard wrote about how humans intently imitate each other, and how that holds society back. He specifically pointed to humans' competitive nature holding back scientific and technological progress. Thiel really connected with this viewpoint, and it fueled his belief that monopolies are actually a good thing.
If you're a startup, you want to get to monopoly. You're starting a new company, you want to get to monopoly.
The anarcho-capitalist views of that contingent were essential in the founding of PayPal, he explained at Libertopia 2010.
The initial founding vision was that we were going to use technology to change the whole world and basically overturn on the monetary system of the world. We could never win an election on getting certain things because we were in such a small minority. But maybe you could actually unilaterally change the world without having to constantly convince people and beg people and plead with people who are never going to agree with you through a technological means. And this is where I think technology is this incredible alternative to politics.
So instead of a worker revolution, what we've been dealing with for the last half century has been a plutocratic revolution. The rich being the rich, their plans have come out a little bit differently than they initially stated. Because when you're running monopolies and oligopolies, you don't have competition, you don't have buyers and sellers, you don't have price discovery, and you certainly don't have a godlike invisible hand. What you do have is the invisible hand of a corporate finger tipping the scales to their advantage. They are a centralized command and control system spanning entire sectors. For example, Cargill, Google, Facebook, Amazon, oh baby, Amazon especially. And I will point out here that if you strip many of the features that are associated with capitalism or market economies, what is left over looks a lot more like what we know as feudalism, or, as I hinted at a little bit earlier, actually, the economy of the Soviet Union. You know, the kind of economy that socialism creates. You know, bravo, guys, you've outdone yourself. You've done better than the socialist ever could. But in its most extreme form, we're talking about a regression to, I don't know, Tsarist Russia, where the common folk, that is you and me, have no rights, no economic rights, no property rights, no voting rights. And believe me, I think they're so incoherent that they would actually drive to that extreme, especially when you look at nutcases like Peter Thiel. He's not alone. He's just the most notorious at this. Now, Peter Thiel learned many of these ideas at Stanford, as do many thousands more learn similar or the same ideas at Ivy League institutions all over the country. And the Ivy League institutions also train many, many other foreign students and indoctrinate them into these ideas. So in the end, the way I look at this is that Russell Kurt and William F. Buckley Jr. have managed to create a new Catholicism of plutocracy. They have their own liturgy. We hear it every day with tax cuts and privatization and academia bad, which I will give them a glancing agreement to because they all learn these ideas in Ivy League institutions. But yeah, it's a religion amongst them. Rather than being the symptoms of a desperate, wealthy elite, this is a symptom of a cult-like madness that the rich have thrown themselves into. It feeds into their sense of entitlement, superiority, and into their selfish interest for profit. There's just too many positive factors pushing them into this direction without any reflection on the consequences or even the coherence of it. It explains their media. It explains the kind of politicians they pick and the sorts of ideas they promote and consider acceptable. Best of all, however, is it's an actionable model. These are ideas that can be repudiated. They shouldn't be repudiated because it's destroying everything around them. Many of their cohort don't even care about America. They want to destroy it and dismantle it, which is a little bit odd because that's exactly what they claimed all of us great unwashed were going to cause. Except it's them doing it. Okay, and that's all I have.